On an ordinary Tuesday in Chicago, Clara Whitmore thought her biggest challenge would be making it through another tight month of rent, groceries, and childcare on her part-time nursing assistant salary. Life had already been unforgiving since her husband left 2 years ago, leaving her alone with a 5-year-old son and a stack of unpaid bills that never seemed to shrink. That morning, everything felt routine until a delivery truck stopped in front of her small apartment building and the driver called out her name, insisting she had a package she never ordered. She almost refused it, but the driver looked rushed, shoved the box into her hands, and left before she could ask questions. Inside her apartment, she stared at the plain brown package sitting on her kitchen counter, not knowing this single moment would spiral into a $2.3 million legal nightmare that would threaten her freedom, her child, and everything she had left. If you're new here, make sure to subscribe, because stories like this reveal how one small mistake can change an entire life forever in ways no one expects. She carefully cut open the tape, expecting maybe a mistaken online order or cheap electronics, but instead found thick folders, sealed documents, and a small encrypted USB drive labeled with a company name she had never heard before. Her hands trembled as she realized this was not a normal delivery error. Something about it felt deeply wrong, like she had been handed something she was never meant to see, and yet now it was sitting in her kitchen, quietly pulling her into a world she didn't understand. Clara tried to convince herself it was harmless, maybe some corporate paperwork mistakenly delivered to the wrong address. But the more she flipped through the documents, the more her anxiety grew. There were financial statements, offshore account references, and legal contracts filled with jargon she could barely understand, all tied to a company called Westbridge Holdings. She had never dealt with anything remotely close to this level of complexity in her life, and yet every page suggested massive sums of money moving through invisible channels. Her son played quietly in the next room, unaware that his mother's hands were now holding something that could destroy their fragile stability. She thought about calling the delivery company, but something stopped her, a gut feeling that this wasn't just a simple mistake that could be corrected with a phone call. Instead, she placed everything back into the box and locked it in her closet, hoping it would somehow disappear if she ignored it long enough. By evening, Clara couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched in some invisible way, as if the box itself carried weight beyond paper and plastic. She searched the company name online and found nothing that made sense, only scattered mentions buried in legal forums and outdated business filings. The lack of clear information only deepened her fear, because things that large and secretive rarely existed without consequences. She considered returning it to the delivery company the next day, but another thought crept in. What if acknowledging it at all put her name on a list she could never escape from? That night, she barely slept, every sound outside her apartment making her flinch. She told herself she would deal with it in the morning, but deep down she already knew that morning would not bring clarity, only the beginning of something far more complicated. The next day, Clara's routine felt different, as if the air itself had changed around her. While getting her son ready for preschool, she kept glancing at the closet where the box was hidden, each glance tightening the knot in her stomach. At work, she struggled to focus, missing small instructions and nearly making mistakes with patients, something that never happened before. Her coworker noticed her distraction, but Clara brushed it off, not ready to explain something she didn't fully understand herself. By the time she returned home that afternoon, there was already a notice slipped under her door from a courier company requesting confirmation about a misdelivered package linked to her address. Her heart dropped instantly, because now it was no longer just something she found. It was something officially recorded, something that had already started to move beyond her control. Clara stood in her small apartment hallway, staring at the notice in her hand, feeling like the paper itself was heavier than it should be, as if it carried consequences instead of ink. The message was simple on the surface, asking her to confirm the receipt of a misdelivered corporate package and schedule its return. But the tone felt strangely formal, almost like it was part of something bigger than a routine shipping error. Her fingers tightened around the paper as she read the company name again and again, Westbridge Holdings, trying to convince herself it meant nothing. Yet the unease in her chest refused to go away. Her son was sitting on the floor nearby, building a small tower of blocks, completely unaware that his mother was standing at the edge of something she didn't understand. Clara told herself she would return the package the next day, but even as she thought it, a deeper fear started forming, because something about the speed of the response from the courier company felt unusual, almost too fast for a simple mistake. That night, after her son fell asleep, Clara finally opened the closet again and pulled out the box with shaking hands, sitting at the kitchen table under the dim light. She placed the documents in front of her more carefully this time, as if they might react to being touched too roughly, and slowly started going through them page by page. The more she read, the more the situation shifted from confusion to something far more serious, because hidden among financial statements were references to legal disputes involving millions of dollars, international transfers, and sealed arbitration agreements. One page in particular made her stomach drop, a contract that appeared to be tied to a financial asset transfer valued at over $2.3 million, with multiple signatures and codes she didn't recognize, but which clearly weren't meant for public eyes. Clara leaned back in her chair, whispering to herself that there was no possible way this belonged in her life. No reason a struggling single mother in a small Chicago apartment would ever be holding something like this. By the next morning, Clara had convinced herself she needed answers before doing anything else, because simply returning the box now felt dangerous in a way she couldn't explain. She searched Westbridge Holdings again, digging deeper into obscure databases and business registries, and this time she found fragments of information that made her hands go cold. The company existed, but not as a normal public-facing business. It appeared tied to multiple shell corporations and ongoing legal investigations involving asset concealment and disputed ownership. Clara wasn't a lawyer, but even she could understand enough to realize this wasn't just a delivery mistake. It was evidence of something highly sensitive. Her instincts told her to walk away immediately, but the problem was already bigger than that, because she had signed for the package without knowing its contents, creating a digital trail that now connected her directly to it. Later that afternoon, a knock came at her apartment door that made Clara freeze in place before she even moved. She slowly approached, peeking through the small peephole, and saw a man in a dark suit standing outside holding a clipboard, his expression calm but unreadable. When he introduced himself as a representative of a legal recovery team working with Westbridge Holdings' receivership case, Clara felt her entire body tense, as if the air had been pulled out of the room. He didn't accuse her of anything, but his questions were precise, asking when she received the package, whether she had opened it, and who else had access to it. Every answer she gave seemed to shift the energy in the conversation, as if each detail was being carefully measured and recorded for something far beyond a simple inquiry. And when he finally asked to see the contents of the package, Clara realized this was no longer about a mistake. It was now about control, ownership, and responsibility she never agreed to take on. Clara hesitated at the doorway, her hand still gripping the edge of the door as the man in the suit waited patiently outside, his expression unreadable but firm. The hallway behind him felt unusually quiet, as if even the building had gone still to listen. She could hear her son moving faintly inside the apartment, the small sounds grounding her in reality, reminding her she was not alone in this situation. The man repeated his request calmly, asking again to review the contents of the package, but this time his tone carried a subtle weight that made it feel less like a request and more like a procedure she was expected to comply with. Clara's mind raced as she thought about the box locked in her closet, the documents inside it that she still didn't fully understand, and the growing sense that returning it might not actually end anything at all. Still, she told him she needed a moment, and slowly closed the door, leaning against it as her heart pounded, realizing that whatever was happening outside her apartment had already moved far beyond her control. Inside, Clara paced in tight circles, trying to think logically while panic slowly pressed in from every direction. She considered pretending the package had been returned, but the courier notice, the digital signature record, and now this visitor made it clear that denying involvement would only make things worse. Her eyes drifted toward her son's bedroom, and the thought of him being pulled into anything connected to this situation made her stomach twist. After several minutes of silence, she made a decision she didn't fully understand herself, but felt forced into nonetheless. She reopened the closet, pulled out the box, and placed it carefully on the kitchen table again, her hands trembling as if she was handling something fragile and dangerous at the same time. When she finally opened the door again, she told the man she would allow him to review the contents, but only if everything was documented in front of her, because she was not letting herself become invisible in whatever this was becoming. The man stepped inside without hesitation, but his demeanor changed slightly once he saw the box, as if confirming something he already suspected. He pulled out a compact device and began photographing the contents methodically, scanning each document with quiet precision while occasionally making brief notes. Clara watched closely, trying to read his reactions, but he remained emotionally distant, treating everything like standard procedure, despite the apparent weight of the materials. At one point, he paused over the USB drive, holding it up for a second longer than the rest, and asked if she had attempted to access it. Clara admitted she hadn't, and something about her answer seemed to ease him slightly, though he didn't explain why. Instead, he closed his notebook and informed her that the package was part of an ongoing legal asset recovery case involving disputed ownership of funds totaling millions, and that her receipt of it had now been officially recorded as a chain of custody irregularity, a phrase that sounded simple but carried an implication she didn't yet fully understand. After he left, Clara sat in silence for a long time, staring at the closed door, feeling as if her apartment had become smaller than it was before he arrived. The words, chain of custody irregularity, kept repeating in her mind, and she finally looked them up, discovering that they were often used in high-level financial disputes and legal investigations where evidence handling could affect ownership claims. That realization made her chest tighten, because it meant her accidental involvement wasn't being treated as harmless. It was being documented as part of a legal process that could escalate. She looked at her son again, sleeping peacefully, and felt an overwhelming fear that whatever this was, it wasn't going to stay contained outside their lives anymore. And just as she tried to convince herself that cooperating fully would protect her, her phone buzzed with an unknown number calling repeatedly, refusing to stop until she answered. Clara stared at the phone vibrating on the kitchen table, the unknown number lighting up the screen again and again like it refused to be ignored. Each buzz felt sharper than the last, and for a moment she considered not answering at all, letting it go to voicemail and pretending it never happened. But the memory of the man in the suit, his calm certainty and careful wording, kept pressing on her mind, making silence feel like the wrong choice. Finally, with a shaky breath, she answered the call and brought the phone to her ear, not speaking immediately. For a few seconds there was only static, and then a woman's voice came through, calm but professional, introducing herself as a legal compliance officer assigned to the Westbridge Holdings asset recovery case. The tone was polite, but there was no friendliness in it, only structure and urgency hidden beneath controlled language. The officer explained that Clara's receipt and temporary possession of the package had triggered a mandatory legal review because of the nature of the materials inside. She used terms like sensitive financial instruments, restricted documentation, and jurisdictional dispute, none of which made Clara feel any closer to understanding what she was involved in. What she did understand, however, was that her name was now officially attached to something extremely serious. The officer asked detailed questions, whether anyone else had access to the package, whether she had copied or transferred any information, and whether the USB drive had ever been connected to any device. Clara answered carefully, her voice tight, aware that every response was being recorded and analyzed. When she said she had not accessed anything, there was a pause on the other end, followed by a measured acknowledgement that her cooperation was noted, but the case was still active and required continued monitoring. After the call ended, Clara felt a strange heaviness settle in her chest, as if the walls of her apartment were slowly closing in without physically moving. She sat at the table for a long time, replaying every detail of the conversation, trying to find the point where a simple delivery mistake turned into something that required monitoring. Her instincts told her she should immediately distance herself from the entire situation, return the package, and cut all contact. But reality no longer felt that simple, because now there were records, signatures, calls, and official acknowledgments tying her to the box in ways she didn't fully understand. Even if she returned it, she wasn't sure it would erase her involvement. It might only confirm it. Later that night, Clara noticed something that made her blood run cold. While checking her phone again, she realized there was now an unfamiliar app-like icon that had never been there before, sitting quietly among her usual applications. She tried to convince herself it was a system update or something she had accidentally downloaded, but when she tapped it, nothing opened. No interface, no error message, just silence. That silence felt more threatening than anything else she had experienced so far, because it suggested access without visibility, presence without explanation. Her thoughts immediately went back to the USB drive sitting in the box, still untouched in her closet, and she wondered if simply having the package in her home had already created a connection she couldn't see. Before she could process it further, another knock echoed through her apartment door, sharper and more urgent than before, making her freeze where she stood. This time, there was no hesitation, no slow approach or calm introduction outside, just a firm, repeated knock that demanded immediate attention. Clara moved slowly toward the door, her heart pounding louder with every step, and when she looked through the peephole, she saw not one man, but two this time, both standing rigidly in the hallway. One of them she recognized, the same suit, same calm expression, but the second man was different, holding a sealed folder marked with red identification tags she couldn't read clearly. And as they waited in silence outside her door, Clara realized this was no longer just a request for cooperation. It was turning into something far more formal and far more serious than anything that had happened before. Clara didn't open the door immediately. She stood, frozen, her forehead almost touching the peephole, watching the two men in the hallway as if any sudden movement might trigger something irreversible. The apartment behind her felt unusually loud in its silence. The ticking clock, the distant hum of the refrigerator, even her own breathing seemed amplified. The man she recognized maintained the same calm posture as before, hands folded neatly in front of him, while the second man shifted slightly, holding the sealed folder closer to his chest, like it contained something fragile and highly controlled. Clara's instincts screamed at her not to engage, but the knocking came again, firmer this time, followed by the familiar voice asking her to open the door for formal notification delivery regarding an active legal matter. The phrase, formal notification, made her stomach drop, because it didn't sound like a conversation anymore. It sounded like procedure. When she finally opened the door just a few inches, the cold hallway air rushed in, and the lead man immediately stepped forward, not aggressively, but with practiced efficiency. He introduced the second man as a federal liaison connected to the financial receivership overseeing Westbridge Holdings' disputed assets, a description that made Clara feel like she was standing in front of something far larger than she could mentally process. Without waiting for permission, the second man carefully opened the sealed folder and pulled out a stack of documents, all stamped with official markings and tracking codes. He explained that Clara's receipt of the misdelivered package had now escalated into a formally documented custody incident due to the potential value and legal sensitivity of its contents. As he spoke, Clara kept glancing between the papers and their faces, trying to understand how a mistake in delivery had evolved into something involving federal oversight and asset disputes worth millions. The man she recognized then said something that made everything feel even heavier. He explained that the package Clara had received was not random. It was part of a contested financial evidence set tied to a frozen offshore account worth approximately $2.3 million, currently under legal investigation between multiple claimants. Clara felt her knees weaken slightly, gripping the doorframe to steady herself, because hearing the number spoken aloud made it feel suddenly real in a way the documents never had. The second man added calmly that while Clara was not being accused of wrongdoing, her possession of the materials had created a legal possession link that needed to be resolved through formal transfer protocols. He used words like neutral party handling, temporary custodial association, and risk mitigation review, all of which blurred together in Clara's mind, but the underlying message was clear. She was now part of a legal structure she never agreed to enter. Inside her apartment, Clara finally let them in again, but this time the atmosphere felt different. Less like an inquiry and more like documentation of a process already underway. The second man placed the documents on her kitchen table and began outlining options in a structured tone, none of which sounded like real choices. One option involved immediate surrender of all materials with signed affidavits and full cooperation, while another required extended verification procedures that could involve audits, interviews, and possible legal questioning regarding chain of custody handling. Clara listened silently, her mind stuck on one thought. She was a single mother barely keeping her life together, and somehow she was now being spoken to like someone involved in a financial crime case worth millions. Her son's toys were scattered in the corner of the room, painfully normal against the surreal seriousness unfolding at her kitchen table. After several minutes, the lead man finally asked her a question that changed the direction of everything: whether she had ever attempted to contact, transfer, or investigate the contents beyond what she already described. Clara shook her head immediately, but her hesitation before answering did not go unnoticed. The second man exchanged a brief glance with the first, then calmly informed her that, due to procedural caution, her digital devices may need to be temporarily reviewed to ensure no unintended access or data exposure had occurred. The words "device review" landed like a final warning she didn't fully understand, but instinctively feared. And as Clara looked at her locked closet again, where the box still sat untouched except for her initial opening, she realized something unsettling. The situation was no longer about what she had done, but about what everyone believed she might still be capable of doing. Clara felt the room tighten around her as soon as the words "device review" were mentioned, as if the air itself had become heavier. She instinctively stepped back from the table, placing herself between the men and the hallway leading to her son's room, without even realizing she had moved. The second man kept his tone steady, almost rehearsed, explaining that the review was a standard precaution in cases involving disputed financial assets and potential data exposure risks. But to Clara, nothing about this felt standard. Her life had never included phrases like data exposure risk or custodial association review, and now they were being directed at her as if she belonged in that world. The man she recognized from before tried to soften the moment, saying they were not there to accuse her of anything, only to ensure the situation remained controlled. But the more they spoke, the more Clara felt like control had already slipped away from her entirely. She finally asked the only question that had been building inside her since the beginning, her voice unsteady but firm enough to cut through their explanation. She wanted to know why her name was even attached to something worth millions when she had nothing to do with it. The second man didn't hesitate, as if he had expected that question from the start. He explained that in high-value asset disputes, possession, even accidental possession, creates a legal point of contact, and that point of contact can become part of evidence chains, ownership claims, or compliance audits. He added that the system didn't distinguish between intention and circumstance at the early stages. It only recorded involvement. Clara stood there silently, absorbing words that felt designed for a world she was never meant to enter. All she could think about was how a wrong delivery had somehow turned her into a recorded involvement in a financial dispute she still didn't fully understand. The conversation shifted again when the lead man asked to confirm whether she had any external communication regarding the package since receiving it. Clara hesitated for a fraction of a second too long before answering no, because she suddenly remembered the unknown phone call from the previous night and the strange sense that something had appeared on her phone. She didn't mention it immediately, unsure whether it was relevant or even safe to bring up. But the hesitation was enough. The second man's expression changed slightly, and he asked her to clarify if there had been any unauthorized digital contact or system anomalies. That phrase made her heart race because it sounded uncomfortably close to what she had experienced. She told them about the missed calls and the strange icon that had appeared briefly on her phone, watching carefully for their reaction. Instead of surprise, they exchanged a quick, controlled look, as if confirming something internally rather than learning something new. Without warning, the second man pulled out a compact device and asked her to place her phone on the table. Clara hesitated, but the calm certainty in his voice left no room for refusal. As she set it down, he explained that they would perform a basic diagnostic scan to ensure no unauthorized linkage had occurred between her device and the disputed materials. The word linkage made Clara's chest tighten again because it suggested connection, access, and something she had never knowingly allowed. While the device scanned her phone, the room fell into an uncomfortable silence, broken only by the faint tapping sounds from the equipment. The lead man stood near the kitchen window, watching the street outside as if expecting something, while Clara remained fixed in place, her thoughts circling her son asleep in the next room, and the growing realization that her private life was no longer private at all. When the scan finally stopped, the second man looked down at the screen for a long moment without speaking. That silence lasted just long enough to make Clara's stomach sink. Finally, he said that there was indeed a flagged anomaly detected, not a confirmed breach, but a non-standard digital trace pattern that required escalation for review. Clara felt her throat go dry as he explained that this didn't necessarily mean wrongdoing, but it did mean her involvement was no longer considered passive or isolated. The lead man finally turned from the window and looked directly at her for the first time with a more serious expression, telling her that from this point forward, the situation would likely move into formal legal processing. And in that moment, Clara understood something she hadn't fully accepted before. The delivery box in her closet was no longer just an object she found by mistake. It had already rewritten her entire life, whether she agreed to it or not. Clara stood completely still as those words settled in the room. Formal legal processing. It sounded clean when they said it, almost harmless, like paperwork and procedures, but her body reacted like it meant something far more permanent. The hum of the scanning device had stopped, yet the silence it left behind felt even louder. Her phone remained on the table, face down like evidence instead of a personal object, and Clara suddenly realized how quickly her entire life had shifted from private routine to monitored system. The lead man's expression softened slightly, but it wasn't comfort. It was the kind of look people give when they've already moved past the emotional stage of a situation and into resolution mode. He explained that the anomaly detected on her device didn't automatically imply wrongdoing, but it did require her cooperation in what he called a structured clarification process. Clara almost laughed at the word clarification because nothing about her life felt clear anymore. She finally asked what kept circling in her mind since the beginning, why this was still attached to her at all. She told them she had done nothing except receive a wrongly delivered box, and even that had been forced onto her by a rushed driver. Her voice cracked slightly as she spoke, not from fear alone, but from exhaustion, from the feeling that no matter how many times she explained herself, the situation kept expanding instead of shrinking. The second man listened carefully, then responded in a calm, procedural tone that made everything worse. He said that at this stage, intent was no longer the primary factor. Trace involvement, digital contact, and custodial exposure were what determined escalation pathways. Clara repeated those words silently in her head, trying to understand how a mistake could generate escalation pathways that now seemed to be consuming her entire reality. The lead man then made a decision that changed the direction of the visit. He said that due to the flagged anomaly and the sensitive nature of the disputed assets, they would need to temporarily secure the physical package pending higher-level review. He didn't say confiscate, but that was exactly what it felt like. Clara's body tightened instinctively, and for the first time since this began, she felt a flash of resistance instead of confusion. She asked if that meant she was being blamed for something, and the second man immediately clarified that she was not under accusation, but rather under protective procedural containment. The phrase made no sense to her, and she said that out loud, her frustration finally breaking through. The lead man paused for a moment, then responded more directly, saying that in cases involving disputed financial instruments of this magnitude, containment was standard until ownership and access chains were fully verified. Clara walked to the closet slowly, her legs feeling heavier with every step, as if she was carrying the weight of every document she had ever seen inside that box. When she pulled it out, she noticed something she hadn't before. The edges of the seal looked slightly different, as if it had been examined or opened again when she wasn't paying attention. That realization sent a sharp chill through her, because she was certain she hadn't touched it since the last inspection. She placed it on the table, her hands shaking slightly, while the second man immediately began photographing and logging it again, this time more carefully, more formally, as if the object had gained importance since the last time they saw it. As the process continued, Clara's attention drifted toward her son's room. The door was still closed, the apartment still quiet, but her mind was no longer fully inside this space. She was thinking about how quickly strangers had moved into her life, how quickly her personal world had been converted into documentation, scanning, and procedural language. When the lead man finally spoke again, he told her that once the package was transferred, her immediate involvement might be reduced, but only after a full review of the anomaly tied to her device. Clara looked at him and asked quietly if her life would go back to normal after all this. The question hung in the air longer than any of his answers had so far, and for the first time, he didn't respond immediately. And in that pause, Clara understood something she didn't want to accept. That normal might no longer be something anyone in this situation could promise her again. Clara noticed the silence before she noticed anything else. The lead man didn't answer her question right away, and that hesitation felt heavier than any explanation he had given so far. The second man continued carefully labeling and photographing the box, but even his movements seemed slower now, more deliberate, as if the situation had shifted into a new phase without anyone announcing it. Clara stood near the kitchen counter, watching both of them, feeling like she was no longer a participant in what was happening in her own home. The word normal still echoed in her mind, but it already felt distant, almost fictional, like something she used to understand but no longer had access to. Finally, the lead man cleared his throat slightly and said that return to baseline conditions would depend entirely on the outcome of the escalation review, a phrase that gave her no comfort at all. Before Clara could respond, the second man suddenly paused his work and looked at the inside flap of one of the documents more closely than before. His expression didn't change dramatically, but there was a subtle shift, like he had found something that didn't match what he expected. He asked the lead man to take a look, and for the first time, their calm coordination broke into something more focused. Clara stepped forward slightly, trying to see what they were looking at, but they angled the document away instinctively, not aggressively, but protectively. The lead man finally spoke in a lower tone, saying that there appeared to be an additional reference code embedded in the paperwork that hadn't been included in the initial transfer record. Clara didn't understand what that meant, but she understood the reaction. It was not supposed to be there. The second man then made a call without stepping outside, speaking briefly but clearly into the phone, using technical phrases Clara couldn't fully follow. She caught fragments like verification mismatch, secondary authorization marker, and unlisted attachment protocol, each phrase making her feel more like she was standing inside a system rather than a home. When he ended the call, he looked at the lead man and said they would need to temporarily pause the transfer process. That sentence immediately changed the energy in the room again. Clara asked what was wrong, her voice sharper now, no longer passive but strained with frustration. The lead man replied carefully that the documentation attached to the package suggested a secondary layer of authorization that required confirmation before any custody resolution could proceed. Clara felt her chest tighten. It was as if every answer she received only created two more questions. She asked them directly if this meant the package was more important than they initially believed. The second man didn't deny it. Instead, he said that discrepancies like this often indicated either internal restructuring of asset ownership or incomplete disclosure during the initial seizure process. Clara didn't know what any of that meant in real terms, but she understood the implication. The situation was not just complicated, it was unstable. And somehow, she was standing at the center of it without ever choosing to be there. Then something happened that made the room feel completely different. The lead man's phone buzzed, and when he looked at it, his expression changed in a way Clara had not seen before, still controlled, but sharper, more alert. He stepped slightly away, spoke a few words quietly, and then returned with a new kind of focus in his eyes. He informed Clara that due to the newly discovered authorization code, The package could not be moved until additional verification from a higher authority was completed. For the first time, the word higher didn't sound procedural. It sounded distant, powerful, and unreachable. Clara looked at the box sitting on her table and realized something unsettling. It was no longer just a misdelivered item. It had become something that even the people investigating it could not fully control anymore, and she was still the only person physically holding it. Clara slowly looked at the box again, and for the first time since all of this began, it didn't feel like just paperwork and confusion. It felt like an anchor. Not something she was holding, but something holding her in place. The room was quieter now, but it wasn't peaceful. It was the kind of silence that forms right before decisions are made that cannot be undone. The lead man stepped slightly back, speaking in a lower tone to the second man, and Clara caught fragments again. Restricted chain, authorization conflict, and temporary hold status. None of it sounded like anything that belonged in her life, yet every word was still being attached to her kitchen table, her apartment, her name. She suddenly became aware of how ordinary everything around them still looked. The fridge magnets, her son's backpack by the wall, a half-finished cup of cold coffee, while something massive and invisible was unfolding inside the same space. The second man finally closed the folder and said that until higher-level confirmation was received, they could not complete the transfer or finalize her removal from the chain of custody record. Clara immediately latched onto that phrase. Removal. She asked him what exactly that meant for her. He replied carefully that her involvement would remain active in the system until all authorization discrepancies were resolved and the asset was officially reassigned or neutralized through legal clearance. The word neutralized made her stomach drop, even though she wasn't sure it applied to her or the box or the process itself. Everything was starting to blur together, and Clara realized she was no longer asking questions for answers. She was asking them just to keep herself grounded. Then, something unexpected happened. The lead man received another message on his phone, and this time he didn't just read it. He froze for a fraction of a second before handing it to the second man. Clara noticed the change instantly. Their controlled professionalism tightened into something more rigid, more serious. The second man reread the message twice, then quietly said that the secondary authorization code had been matched, but not through their internal system. Clara felt her heartbeat spike because she could tell that was not supposed to happen. The lead man asked for clarification, and the second man replied that the code appeared to have been confirmed externally through a separate legal authentication channel that was not part of their current case file. Clara finally spoke, her voice shaky but urgent, asking what that meant in normal terms. The lead man hesitated before answering, and when he did, his words were slower than before. He said it meant that someone else, outside their immediate team, had already acknowledged ownership or legal control over the same package. The problem was not just conflicting paperwork anymore. It was conflicting authority. Clara looked down at the box again, and for the first time, she felt something beyond fear. She felt trapped in a system she had never even known existed, where multiple invisible forces were now claiming the same object inside her home. As the realization settled in, the second man received another call, and this time, he didn't hide it. He simply said, "We have an escalation response inbound." Clara asked what that meant, but neither of them answered immediately. The lead man finally looked at her and said she should remain calm and stay exactly where she was until further instruction arrived. Those words should have reassured her, but instead they made her feel like time itself had slowed down around her. Because in that moment, Clara understood the most terrifying part of all. This was no longer about a misdelivery, or a mistake, or even her involvement. Something much larger had already noticed the box sitting on her table, and now it was responding. Clara stood very still as the phrase "escalation response inbound" hung in the air, but nothing dramatic immediately followed it. No sudden force, no chaos. Just a shift in energy that felt quieter and more controlled than anything before. The lead man exhaled slowly and looked at the second man, and for the first time since they arrived, their confidence seemed to settle rather than tighten. The second man confirmed softly that the external authentication match had triggered a jurisdictional override, meaning the case was no longer solely under their control. Clara didn't understand the legal language, but she understood the change in tone. This wasn't escalation toward her anymore. It was escalation away from her. The box still sat on her kitchen table, but suddenly it felt less like it was dragging her into something, and more like she was standing at the edge of something she was finally being released from. Within minutes, another team arrived. Not loud, not chaotic, but precise and coordinated. They introduced themselves briefly as part of a federal financial oversight unit handling disputed multi-entity asset recovery cases. There were more documents, more scanning devices, and more quiet communication, but none of it involved questioning Clara the way before. Instead, she was asked to confirm her identity once more and verify that she had not accessed or transferred any contents from the package. Her answers were recorded, acknowledged, and then treated as sufficient. The new lead reviewer examined the box and its contents carefully, then confirmed something that shifted the entire atmosphere. Clara Whitmore had no intentional or actionable involvement in the disputed ownership chain, and her receipt of the package was classified as a misrouted delivery event with incidental exposure only. For the first time, Clara felt the room loosen around her, as if she could breathe without being measured. The original two men stepped back as the new team finalized their review. The second man offered a brief, professional acknowledgement that her cooperation had been logged and that no further contact would be required unless legally necessary. It wasn't emotional, but it carried finality. They carefully removed the box from her table, sealing it into a reinforced case, and for a moment, Clara felt a strange emptiness watching it leave, as if something that had consumed her life for days was finally exiting her world. No sirens, no dramatic exits, just quiet resolution. The lead man gave a final nod before leaving, and then they were gone. The apartment suddenly felt too normal, too quiet, like it was trying to pretend nothing had ever happened. Clara stood in the same spot for a long time, her son still asleep in the next room, realizing how close she had come to losing her sense of stability over something she never even chose. Later that night, after everything was over, Clara sat alone at her kitchen table again, staring at the empty space where the box had been. There were no more knocks, no calls, no alerts on her phone. Even the strange icon was gone. It was as if the system that had surrounded her had quietly detached itself, leaving no trace except exhaustion. She didn't feel victorious or traumatized, just deeply aware of how fragile normal life really was, how quickly it could bend under things she could never see coming. And for the first time in days, she felt present again, not inside a process, but inside her own life. Before going to bed, she checked on her son, gently fixed his blanket, and allowed herself a small breath of relief she hadn't felt since this began. If you watched until the end, thank you for staying with this story. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to like this video, share it with someone who loves mysterious real lifestyle stories, and comment what you think you would have done in Clara's situation. And make sure to subscribe for more emotional, cinematic stories like this, because sometimes the most ordinary people end up at the center of the most extraordinary situations, and you never know when the next story will begin.